Tonight we continue our journey in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to pick up in chapter 13, verse 32, and look at the finale of Jesus' speech on the Mount of Olives. And then we're going to get into a new chapter in a new section of the book. We'll make it to chapter 14, verse 9, hopefully, by the time we're done. And again, we're in this last section. It's the Passion in Jerusalem. And we're kind of right in the middle of this section that will take us to the conclusion of the book. There are three sections. We've looked at the confrontation between Jesus and the religious leaders. And it's interesting that confrontation ends with Jesus leaving the temple for the last time, also pronouncing that the temple would be destroyed, which gives rise to that coming event speech that Jesus gives in chapter 13. And then chapter 14 will actually begin the crucifixion story, at least all those events leading up to that. And it will conclude with the resurrection, the empty tomb, and the resurrection appearances. We've been looking at the coming event speech, and we've almost completed this. It's an interesting speech and a little bit difficult to decipher at points. It begins with Jesus predicting that the temple is going to be destroyed. That beautiful temple that the Jewish people, it was their pride and joy. They loved that temple. It was the center of their country. It was one of the great wonders of the ancient world. It was looked upon with just such pleasure and joy that God gave them this wonderful temple. And Jesus predicts it's going to be torn down, which gives rise to some questions that the disciples ask. When's that going to happen, and what are some signs that we can look forward to, knowing that it will happen? So Jesus begins the speech by talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he begins by talking about the signs, and he gives 6 signs. The last one is the most specific. It was the abomination that would take place in the temple, and that happened in AD 68 when the Jewish zealots took over the temple and also took over the high priesthood by appointing a high priest who didn't meet any of the qualifications for being a high priest. But the zealots believed that God was going to give them victory, and they wanted one of their own to lead the country after they overthrew the Romans. So they appointed one of their own as the high priest, because the high priest was both the political and the religious leader of the Jewish people. Then Jesus talks about his second coming, and he talks about him coming in the clouds. He also talks about all of the incredible things that would take place that would accompany his return. And we read about most of those in Revelation chapter 6, when it talks about the return of Christ. So what Jesus spoke, John must have heard quite clearly and recorded in the book of Revelation as well. Then Jesus jumps back and talks about the destruction of Jerusalem again, this time answering the question, when? When will this happen? And Jesus in verse 30 makes the prediction that this generation will not pass away till this is fulfilled. And Jesus spoke that in AD 30. It was fulfilled in AD 70, exactly 40 years later, when the Romans destroyed the temple. We have one last section to go, and that's Jesus talking about his return once again. So Jesus is going to make a big distinction between the time of the temple's destruction and the time of his second coming. When it comes to figuring out when the temple will be destroyed, there are some big clues that Jesus offers. Jesus is really specific. It's going to happen in 40 years or less. And when you see the temple desecrated, you know very shortly thereafter it will be destroyed. So when you see it desecrated, get out of Jerusalem as fast as you can and go hide somewhere so the Romans can't find you and kill you, because they're coming. So that's very specific. But when it comes to a second coming, Jesus doesn't offer hardly any clues at all. In fact, Jesus is going to plainly say, even I don't know when I'm coming back. So that's kind of an interesting thing, because after hearing what he had to say about the temple's destruction, we are hoping he'd give us some really good clues about when he's coming back. But he does not. He doesn't give us hardly any clues at all. In fact, let me read what he says in chapter 13, and we're going to look at verses 32 through 37, and this will conclude Jesus' speech on the Mount of Olives. So beginning in verse 32, Jesus says, "But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know what time that will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch." So this is Jesus' final words about his second coming. And he begins in verse 32, "but about." So he's been talking about the destruction of the temple. But now he's switching topics once again. This is a different topic. So using the word "but" means Jesus is going to talk about something else. And he's going to talk about that day. The phrase "that day" becomes almost a technical term among Christians for the return of Christ. In fact, we sang a song this evening, quoting a verse in Timothy that talks about that day. That day is the return of Jesus. And it actually comes from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the prophets often talked about the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord was a day of judgment for Israel and the nations. And the day of the Lord, in Christian terminology, now becomes that day or the day. It was the day that they were waiting for, the day in which Jesus would return. So Jesus is no longer talking about the destruction of the temple. He's talking about that day, the day of his coming, the same day that he talked about in verses 24 through 27. And when it comes to the destruction of the temple, Jesus gives a lot of signs. He gives a lot of clues. You could almost figure it out if you were alive at that time. In fact, many Christians did. Many Jewish Christians left Jerusalem, traveled up to the mountain area of Pella, and hid from the Romans, and they survived the attack that the Romans had on Jerusalem because they knew what Jesus said, and they followed what Jesus said. They got out of town, and they went and hid. But when it comes to the second coming, the time when Jesus returns, Jesus will say that no one knows. And then he gets really specific about who doesn't know. Not even the angels in heaven. So apparently God has not told the angels when to get ready for this, because several of the angels are coming back with him. But God hasn't told the angels when that's going to happen. And then Jesus says, nor the Son, talking about himself. Jesus says, I don't know when I'm coming back. And that's a surprise. In fact, a lot of people are a little nervous about that. I mean, Jesus is God the Son. I mean, isn't he supposed to know everything? But Jesus took on flesh and blood. And apparently, living as a person, he didn't know everything. And Jesus readily admits, I can't tell you when I'm coming back because I don't know. The only one who does know is the Father. God knows when all of this is going to unfold, but no one else knows. So how do you prepare for an event when you don't know when it's going to happen? Well, Jesus says in verse 33, be on guard, be alert. So since Jesus is coming back, and we don't know when, we have to be on alert all the time. We have to be ready in every moment. Now, Jesus didn't say, try to figure it out and make some calculations. Now, there are some ministries who thrive on doing just that, trying to figure out when Jesus is coming back and making their prophecies and predictions about when that might take place, and figuring out all of these charts about what's going to happen, and this is going to happen first, and this will happen second, and basically they piece together a lot of different references, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and try to make sense of the whole thing. Well, apparently even Jesus didn't even try that. I mean, he didn't try to say, well, give me a couple days and let me see if I can figure this out. He didn't say that. He simply said, I don't know. So you're going to have to be ready all the time. You must be prepared every moment, because you do not know when that time will come. Then Jesus is going to tell a story in verse 34, and he's going to make some comments in verses 35 and 36 about the story. The story is given here in verse 34. It's kind of like a mini parable, and Jesus tells a story about a man who goes away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, which that was normal back in the first century. The owner of the house would leave and he would put his servants in charge. He would also give them assigned tasks to do, which they were to do. And by the time he got back, those tasks had better be done. He also talks about the one at the door was to keep watch. Now, as we look at this parable, it's obvious that the man going away is Jesus. He's going away, and one day he's coming back. Jesus may be gone for a short time. He may be gone for an extended period of time. He doesn't know, and the disciples don't know either. Well, it's been almost 2,000 years, so I would say it's an extended period of time. It's interesting that the disciples in the first century thought he was coming back in their lifetime. In fact, I really don't know of a generation of Christians who didn't think that Jesus might just come back in their lifetime. So for the past 2,000 years, the church has waited for Jesus, but he's not here yet. And so we continue to wait. We continue to be on guard, to be alert. Now, how do we do that? Does it mean that we sit in our front yard and look up in the sky and see if we can spot him? No, that's not what he meant. When he said to be on guard, that's not exactly what he had in mind. What he had in mind was we're to be about the task that he has given us to do. That's how we wait for Jesus to come. We're to be about his business, spreading his gospel, growing in our faith, doing all of those things day by day that draw us closer to him, that make us stronger in our faith, and also able to share our faith with others. We need to be about spreading the gospel to the entire world. That's what Jesus wants his servants, and the servants are the disciples. So Jesus says, I'm leaving, and you guys are in charge. And that's kind of how it happened in the upper room when the Holy Spirit came on the disciples. And they were the ones who spread his message. They were in charge, and they led the church. And now they're to be about their task and to keep watch for Jesus to return. Therefore, keep watch, because you don't know when the owner of the house will come back. Now, it was the responsibility of the doorkeeper to make sure that he doesn't let in anyone who's not wanted, unwelcomed, like false messiahs. So that's what he has in mind. As the doorkeeper, you don't want to embrace a false Messiah or a false doctrine. But at the same time, you have to be ready to receive Jesus when he returns. And Jesus could return in the evening, at midnight, when the rooster crows, or at dawn. These were the 4 watches during the night for the Romans. The Jewish people had 3 watches, but the Romans had 4. And Mark records the 4 because he's writing to Gentiles. He's writing to Romans. And it could be in the evening. It could be at midnight when the rooster crows. Reminds me of when I went to Belize. And that's been probably about 8 or 9 years ago. I think it's about 3 o'clock in the morning when that rooster would crow. And from where we were staying in the motel, oh, could you hear that rooster? I mean, I had earplugs in, and it woke me up. That rooster is louder than any alarm clock I've ever had. But about 3 o'clock in the morning, he would cut loose. And I was going, it's like, I got 3-4 more hours to sleep. What are you doing? So, and then there's dawn, which is 6 o'clock in the morning. So we don't know when Jesus might return. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. In other words, he gave you stuff to do. He needs to come back and find you doing what he's given you to do, not sleeping, not being lazy, not giving up on what he has called you to do. So Jesus wants his disciples to be about his business until the day comes when he returns. And he makes that quite clear in a kind of a sly way in verse 37. He says, what I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. Now, throughout this speech, the word that gets repeated more than any word is the word watch. Be on your guard. He tells them early on in verse 5 and in verse 23, watch out that you're not deceived by a false teacher or somebody coming along claiming to be the Messiah. Because if it's not me, they're not the Messiah. So don't be deceived. Then in verse 9 he says, be on your guard because persecution is coming. I don't want you to be surprised when it comes. And now in verse 33 and verse 37, I want you to watch and be ready for my return. I want you to be about my business when I come back. And then he says, what I say to you, meaning the disciples, I say to everyone. Jesus didn't know when he was coming back, but maybe he had a hint that it might be a while. Not just the disciples, but everyone is to be about Jesus' business, doing the task he's given us until he returns. That's what Jesus has to say about his second coming in terms of when that's going to happen. And in the Gospel of Matthew, not only did the disciples ask him about the destruction of the temple, they also asked him about his return and the end of the age. When is the end coming? And Jesus says, I don't know, but you need to be ready for it every single day of your life. That was his answer. I wish he would have given more clues, but he did not. There are those who think that the clues for the destruction of the temple will be repeated at the end. If we're alive when that happens, we'll be able to check that out. It's a possibility. Many believe that some of the same things that happened in the first century would be repeated right before Jesus returns, but we'll have to wait and see when that happens. We're now about to enter the last section of the book. And again, looking at Act 3, which is the Passion in Jerusalem, we've looked at the confrontation. We've now finished the coming event speech. Now there's one section left, and that's the crucifixion and resurrection. Jesus has been talking about this for a long time. In fact, ever since Simon Peter made the declaration, Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, Jesus has been saying, we're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed, handed over to the Gentiles, executed, and on the third day I will rise again. And Jesus said that at least 3 times to the disciples. Not sure they ever got it, but he said it again and again to them. And now the fulfillment of Jesus' prediction is going to begin. And in this final section, here's our outline. We're going to look at the preparations for the arrest of Jesus in chapter 14, verses 1 through 11. We're going to look at the Last Supper and what transpired during that Last Supper. Then Jesus went out to the Garden of Gethsemane and what he said and what he prayed. Then Jesus will get arrested and he will stand trial. He will have a Jewish trial. He will have a Roman trial, and we will look at both. Then beginning in chapter 15, verse 16, it's the crucifixion, the death, and the burial. And then it ends in chapter 16 looking at the empty tomb and the resurrection, that Jesus is alive. And we'll look at those who saw him alive. So we're going to begin tonight by looking at the preparations for Jesus' arrest. And Mark is going to do something that he's done several times in the gospel. It's a literary technique. It's called intercalation, sometimes called bracketing, sometimes called sandwiching. And in case you forgot, here's how that goes. Mark's going to begin by telling a story, but he's not going to finish the story. He's going to leave us hanging. Then he's going to tell a second story, and he'll complete that story. Then he'll go back and finish the first story. Here's how it looks like in chapter... Did I not have that? I didn't bring that slide. Okay, here's how it looks like in chapter 14. In verses 1 and 2, the religious leaders are plotting to kill Jesus. They've been plotting all along to get rid of him. But Mark's going to leave us hanging because at the end of verse 2, they don't have a plan. They want to get rid of Jesus, but they don't have a plan to do that. Then in verses 3 through 9, Mark's going to tell this story of an unnamed woman who's going to take a bottle of perfume and basically dump it on Jesus' head. And then in verses 10 through 11, we go back to the first part of the story. The chief priest and the religious leaders finally come up with a plan because now they have someone else on their side to help pull it off. And his name is Judas Iscariot. When Judas Iscariot enters the picture, he comes up with a plan that the religious leaders like. And so they're going to make that plan a reality. Now, whenever you eat a sandwich, you have to pay attention to what's in the middle of the sandwich. What's in the middle of the sandwich is this unnamed woman who is devoted to Jesus. And out of gratitude or out of her deep faith, she takes what she owns, which is a very expensive bottle of perfume, pours it on Jesus' head as a way of showing love and devotion to Jesus. The religious leaders are trying to kill Jesus. Judas Iscariot is about to betray Jesus. But this woman, whose name is not even mentioned, dearly loves Jesus. She stands in stark contrast to the others. She's the picture of what a disciple ought to be. While the religious leaders, who should have recognized Jesus, who should have loved Jesus, instead want to kill him. And then one of the 12, who's been with Jesus for 3.5 years, for whatever reason, has decided to betray him. and switch sides. But the woman gets it right. And in the first century culture, for, the religious leaders, the big shots, the big shot men, they get it wrong. The disciples, one of Jesus' closest disciples, gets it wrong. And who gets it right? A woman. And that's shocking in the first century. Not today. But in the first century, that's a complete shock. But that's exactly what takes place. So, the plot to arrest Jesus. There have been plots before. In fact, all the way back in chapter 3, the Pharisees and the Herodians were looking for a way to kill Jesus. And on several other occasions, some of the religious leaders wanted to get rid of Jesus. This is the final plot, and yes, it is the successful plot to get rid of Jesus. So since it's only 2 verses, let's just go through it. It says, "Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away. And the chief priest and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him." It's the Passover. In fact, this whole week since Jesus entered Jerusalem has been preparation for the Passover week. The Passover's coming. It's not here yet, but people are just flocking into Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's getting very, very crowded, and people are arriving to celebrate the Passover. The Passover commemorates the greatest event in Israelite history, the number 1 salvation event in the entire Old Testament, when God rescues the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and sets them free. It was the night of the 10th plague, when the firstborn in Egypt die, and the firstborn among the Hebrews is kept alive because of the blood on the door, and Pharaoh finally says, "Get out of here." Changes his mind 15 minutes later, but hey, he finally said, "Get out of here." And they left. And the Jewish people have been celebrating that event, remembering that event, retelling that event ever since it happened. Even today, Jewish people will meet and celebrate the Passover. Then there's the festival of unleavened bread, and it lasts for a week. And it immediately follows the Passover. So the Passover takes place really on 2 days because of how, if we look at it from our perspective or their perspective, it's on the month of Nisan, the 14th and 15th. On the 14th, in the afternoon, all the lambs are slaughtered for the Passover meal at the temple. At least they were in the first century. Then that meal was to be eaten after sunset. And at sunset, the Jewish day changes. For us, it changes at midnight. But for them, at sundown, which then would have been about 6 p.m., it's a new day. So the lamb is slaughtered on the 14th, but it's not eaten until the 15th, but it's just a few hours. But the sun went down and a new day has started. The festival of unleavened bread begins on the 15th and goes to the 21st. So this is a huge celebration of 8 days. I mean, it was like an 8-day Christmas, For us, instead of a one-day event, it's going to last a week and a day. So it's a huge celebration among the Jewish people. And according to Mark, it's only 2 days away. Now, the Jewish people calculate days a little differently than we do. If I were to tell you on Wednesday evening that something's going to happen in 2 days, what day am I talking about? You guys don't agree. I thought that was going to be easy. If I tell you on Wednesday something's going to happen in 2 days, normally it would be Friday. But for a Jewish person, if they tell you that, it would happen on the second day. meaning you count the day in which the statement is made, which means it would happen tomorrow. So in 2 days may only mean one day, the next day, on the second day. So the Passover's getting close. And the chief priest and the teachers of the law. Now, we were introduced to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, 70 members on that court. Some of them were the chief priest. Some of them were the teachers of the law. A third group was the elders. The elders are not mentioned, but basically what Mark's talking about is the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin. They have decided to scheme to arrest Jesus. And the word scheming is in the imperfect tense in the Greek, which means there was a lot of discussions that took place. They've been planning this for a long time. They may have had secret meetings about this, trying to figure out how are we going to get rid of Jesus. And I'm sure somebody said, why don't we just send, a bunch of guys and we'll just attack Jesus and the disciples. There's 13 of them, so we'll send 26, and the 26 will kill the 13 and we'll be fine. But they were thinking, no, if that happens, the people might riot. It is Passover, after all. And if the people riot, the Romans show up. And if the Romans show up, a lot of Jewish people die. So let's not do that. Let's find a way to arrest Jesus. But we can't arrest him when he's around a bunch of people because they might get mad if they like Jesus and they might riot. So we have to find a way to arrest him where there's not a lot of people around. And once we arrest him, we'll send him to trial. And we'll convict him of a capital crime. And that means Jesus will be killed. So that was their plan. To arrest Jesus, convict him, and eventually kill him. But they said not during the festival because there's a lot of people here. Now, there's a lot of disagreement about how many people actually lived in Jerusalem in the first century. A lot of estimates are 60 to 70,000 on a normal basis. But during Passover, 300,000 to 500,000. Josephus said there could be as many as 3 million, but most people think Josephus was exaggerating. So if there's 500,000 people, how do you control 500,000 people? Not so easy to do. So they're saying, let's not try to arrest Jesus during the festival, or the people may riot, and we'll have a bigger problem on our hand than we can handle. So that's the plot. They're trying to find a way to get rid of Jesus. And at the end of verse 2, they don't have a plan. They're still scheming, but they don't have a plan. Now we're going to move to the anointing in Bethany. And let me read that story. It's in chapter 14, verses 3 through 9. Beginning with verse 3, it says, while he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor. And they rebuked her harshly. Leave her alone, said Jesus. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. An incredible story of what this woman does. It begins in verse 3, while Jesus was in Bethany. And we learn that when Jesus entered Jerusalem, Jesus did not have a place to stay in Jerusalem, but he had some friends in Bethany. And John tells us that it was Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And Bethany you could walk from Bethany to Jerusalem in about an hour. So every day Jesus would make that journey back and forth. He would commute from Bethany on into Jerusalem, spend the day there, then he'll go back to Bethany. So he's in Bethany, but at this time he's not in the home of Lazarus. He's in the home of Simon the leper. And it's interesting, there were a lot of people called Simon in the first century. They were all named after Simon Maccabees, who was one of the Maccabean children who led the revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes, who committed the abomination of desolation. So it was quite common back in the first century to name your boy Simon. But since they didn't have last names back then, how do you differentiate between all the Simons in your life? Well, this guy is called Simon the leper. Now, he's hosting a dinner party. He doesn't have leprosy right now. Otherwise, nobody would show up to his house if he had leprosy. Chances are he had leprosy. Jesus has healed him. He's now cured. And apparently among the Christians, he was simply called Simon the leper. Maybe because of Simon Peter, to differentiate the two, he's Simon the leper. He opens his home. Jesus is there, and there's this banquet that's taking place. Jesus is reclining at the table, which means it's most likely the evening meal. The Jewish people did not sit at the table in a chair. It was a very low table, and they would recline. And they would eat their food reclining on the floor in front of the table. That was the way they did that. So then a woman shows up. And it was very unusual for a woman to show up to that kind of event. This was a guy's event. And so it was the men who were eating. And if a woman was there, she was normally there to help serve. Normally for these events, a woman would not be an invited guest. So chances are she was not invited. She just showed up. And she shows up with an alabaster jar. And this jar was probably 5 to 9 inches tall. Chances are it had a very narrow neck, so that if you accidentally spilled some of the perfume, you wouldn't spill it all. It would come out very slowly. And she had some very expensive perfume inside that flask. And it was made of pure nard, which was a plant from India, which is why it was so expensive. So chances are this is a wealthy woman, or at least someone married to a wealthy man, that he would buy her this perfume at such a cost. And then she breaks the jar. And she breaks the jar because she's going to pour all of the contents of this perfume on Jesus. So instead of, trying to get it out of the thing, she just breaks it. And by breaking it, she's able to basically dump it on Jesus' head. She pours it all on his head. Now in verse 8, Jesus talks about the fact that she anointed his body. So apparently this perfume dripped down from Jesus' head and covered most of his body. So Jesus is basically covered in perfume at this particular point. And this woman interrupts this dinner party and does this. And it says some of those present, and some is probably a reference to the disciples, because that's who Jesus will address in the next few verses. So some of the disciples were going, what in the world? Did this expensive perfume? And she pours it on Jesus' head? What a waste. Once again, the disciples missed the point. It's not the first time it's happened in the gospel. The disciples just don't have insight into what's taking place. They think that what she did is simply a waste. Then they said it could have been sold for more than a year's wages. In the Greek text, it says 300 denarii, which a denarius was a coin that was given to a common laborer for 1 day's worth of work. You would work for your allotted time. You would be handed a denarius. So this was worth 300 of those, which would be pretty much a year's wages. That's a lot of money. And isn't it interesting how other people think they should tell other people what to do with their money? The disciples, are going to tell this woman what she should have done with her money. If you just want to get rid of the perfume, why don't you sell it and give it to the poor? Don't pour it on Jesus' head. Sell it and give away the money. The idea of giving money to the poor was a custom at Passover. So everybody who shows up in Jerusalem is thinking, what can I do for the poor? And the disciples probably didn't have much money. And they were thinking, wow, we can only give a little bit, but this woman could have given a whole lot if she wouldn't have wasted it. And then it says they rebuked her harshly. Basically, they went on a tirade and just blasted this woman for what she did. And then Jesus gets involved in verse 6. Jesus says, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. Jesus could see past the perfume to what was inside that woman's heart. Now, we're not told why she did this. She could have done it because she heard Jesus was in town and Jesus had done something for her, or maybe healed her or a member of her family, and she was just there to say thank you in the way that she could. Or maybe she recognized Jesus as the Messiah, and because of her faith in Jesus as Messiah, she would pour this on Jesus' head as a way to anoint him, because the word Messiah means the anointed one. And she's about to anoint him with perfume. So we're not sure what her motivation was, but we do know it came from a pure heart of love and devotion. The disciples couldn't see the heart. They just saw dollar signs and thought it was a waste. Then Jesus says to the disciples, the poor you always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. So Jesus is saying that what this woman did, she could only do for a limited amount of time. But if you want to give to the poor, that's something you can do every day, because there will never be a time when there's no one who's poor. Their poor will always be around. You'll have numerous opportunities to give to the poor. But what the woman did for me is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime experience, because Jesus goes on to say, you will not always have me. This was a one-time opportunity, and she seized the moment and did the right thing. Jesus also gives a little prediction of the passion. I'm not going to always be here. I'm leaving, going away, like the man in the parable he told. She did what she could. Jesus looked at her for who she was, and we don't really know her story. But she had the perfume, which obviously meant a lot to her, and she was willing to give it all to Jesus by dumping it on his head. And it was just her way of saying, I love you. Another person may have done something different, but for this woman, she did what she could, based upon who she was. Then Jesus said she poured perfume on my body, which apparently Jesus got perfume everywhere, to prepare for my burial, which I don't believe this woman thought in a million years that that's what she was doing. But that's how Jesus took it, which in the first century Jewish person, they pass away. They don't embalm the body. Before they bury it, they put it in perfume. There's a lot of spices and perfume that go into the tomb with the dead person. But Jesus gets his perfume even before he dies to prepare him for burial, which I'm sure at this point the disciples were thinking, what do you mean burial? What do you need a burial for? And again, Jesus gives a clue about the passion, the fact he's going to die. Not sure they got it, but that's what he told them. Then Jesus says, truly I tell you. And again, that's the amen before he says anything. That's the listen up, I'm about to tell you something very important. Wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, which was kind of interesting that Jesus would say that. He's the Jewish Messiah. The Jewish disciples are not thinking about spreading his message around the globe. They're just thinking about themselves and their fellow Jewish people in Jerusalem and Israel. But Jesus is giving a clue. His message is to be spread throughout the world. He didn't just come as Messiah for Jewish people. He came as the Savior for the entire world. Yes. So Jesus says, when my message gets spread throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. And once Matthew and Mark wrote their Gospels, and the Gospels were circulated and spread and copied again and again, her story lives. And here we are, almost 2,000 years later, talking about her story. A woman who dearly loved Jesus and expressed that love in her own special way based upon who she was. And that's what we should do. As we express our love for Jesus, we may express it differently because we're different. How you show love to Jesus may be different from the way I do. But what matters is what's in the heart. And it's that heart of devotion and love for Jesus. So the religious leaders want to kill Jesus. But this woman dearly loves him. The woman got it right. And the religious leaders got it wrong. And next week we'll pick up with verse 10, and one of the 12 is going to get it horribly wrong. All right, let me close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you. What a remarkable story. A story of love and devotion. And Father, may that inspire us to show by our actions and the things that we do that we love Jesus. And to figure out what that looks like for us, based upon how you've gifted us, based upon where we are in life right now. Father, help us to find those ways to express our love to you and all that you've done for us. Father, thank you for that incredible story and inspiration of a person who gave what she had. And we should do the same. We should give what we have back to you to be used to bring glory and honor and to show love to you. Father, thank you that Jesus is coming. We don't know when, but help us to be about his business until he returns, faithful to the very end. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.